I was born in 1954. The Second War had ended some 9 years before. There is broadly a similar time difference. If you turn now to Daniel 5 verse 31, Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. Interestingly, the events of Daniel 5 are probably at least 70 years after Daniel was taken into captivity. And accordingly, it means that Darius the Mede was born some 8 years into that time of captivity. He wasn't even born when Daniel went into captivity. And here he is, the kingdom coming to this man. We've spoken before about the book of Daniel covering a very long time range. It could well be that Daniel in the Old Testament is very similar to John in the New. That if John is broadly contemporary with the Lord Jesus Christ, and of course we don't know precisely his date of birth in relation to the Lord Jesus. We know John the Baptist in relation to Jesus, but we don't know John the Apostle in relation to Jesus. But if John and Jesus are broadly the same age, then when John writes the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, in around AD 96, very often people believe he's probably about 96 years old at that point. And it could well be that Daniel, looking through the whole of the ministry that's described over these chapters of the book of Daniel, that he reaches a point of being a similar age to John. And now he's probably some 70 years or so into the time when he's been taken into captivity, and God is still using him and dealing with him, although as we look at Daniel 5, it's plain that he has been shelved by the society, by the influential people, by the rulers of the kingdom and the city of Babylon. Because you see, Daniel needs to be introduced to the king, who is reminded of Daniel by the queen. We would probably say this may be the queen mother. And in verse 10, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet hall. And she tells the king, Belshazzar, about this man, Belshazzar, whom his father, in fact we would say his grandfather probably, had brought to the kingdom. But it is as if the king has deliberately shelved Daniel. Daniel tells the king that he had known all the events of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. It wasn't something that was unknown to him, wasn't something that was hidden to him. If you look at verse 22, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. Belshazzar was taught these things, knew these things, but deliberately chose to reject them. And on that basis, he had probably shelved Daniel from any service in his court. And we don't find that Daniel is there with a placard saying, I am the most gifted administrator in the kingdom. I should have a place within your civil service, your bureaucracy. We find that Daniel basically accepts the providence, just as he had accepted the providence many years earlier that took him by way of his captivity into exile. And we see therefore that Daniel is used to responding to providence and has a very straightforward and a very simple trust in God. I actually mentioned after the previous sermon on Belshazzar 2 weeks ago to someone that the book of Daniel is remarkable because Daniel has an unblemished record through the book. And when you think for a man who is probably in his 90s by the time the book finishes, that is a very remarkable thing. It can't really be said of any of the apostles, with the exception of Paul, that they are unblemished in the record that is given to us. John, you see, John, whom I've mentioned, 96 years old when he writes the book of Revelation, potentially. But John, with his brother, is there seeking greatness, seeking to be on a throne on either side of Christ in his kingdom, and seeking for greatness, seeking to be honoured, seeking to be acknowledged. And we find other things. Peter denies Christ 3 times. There is virtually no one of whom there is any detail given to us, any lengthy detail, any lengthy report of their life, whom there is not a blemish recorded. But Daniel, no blemish is recorded. He's a wonderful, godly example of someone who lives in a very hostile, a very rigorous regime, a regime where Nebuchadnezzar, as he describes, would have had power easily to destroy anyone's life, to take anyone's life, and yet Daniel served that king, and Daniel desired good for the king. We don't know for sure, as I intimated 2 weeks ago, whether Nebuchadnezzar was actually converted, whether he had that heart change, whether he was given that new birth, or whether he was simply made God-fearing, or whether he was, as it were, given that sense of destiny. But certainly one of those things happened to him. It would be lovely to be able to talk to him in glory and to realize that he was truly converted, and that he'd been brought down. I just remind you of the way in which Daniel chapter 4, the last verse 37, seems, I think, and I think you can read it in this way, seems to indicate a personal knowledge of God that he'd never had before. And he says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, and his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down." And surely that last phrase is saying that Nebuchadnezzar himself had been humbled by God, and that now he, as an individual, is offering praise to God. Well, Daniel therefore has been effectively shelved, effectively put out of the role and the rule that he had been given over the kingdom by perhaps the grandfather of Belshazzar. And Belshazzar himself is not the ultimate authority. We sometimes like to say, and we could say of Nebuchadnezzar, that he's equivalent perhaps to the most powerful man, the most powerful ruler on earth today. Whether you take that as being the American president or some other figure, but you imagine God dealing with that person. Well, Belshazzar is effectively operating under the authority of another king, under the authority, we might say he's acting as a regent. And therefore when he suggests a reward for Daniel for telling him of the significance of the writing that he'd seen as God has broken in upon him in a very dramatic fashion, he therefore tells Daniel that he will be third ruler in the kingdom, because effectively Belshazzar himself is the second ruler, and therefore he's third. I just want to remind you too of the absolute security of Babylon, that Belshazzar, as he makes this feast, the city is already under siege from the Medes and Persians. There is a besieging army. You would normally expect that there would be great prudence. You'd be rationing your provisions. You'd be very watchful. You wouldn't be allowing your senses to be dulled by alcohol. You'd need to be on call in case there was an attack. But I remember last time I suggested to you that the city of Babylon probably had enough supplies within it for at least 10 years within the city. So the king could afford to say, our walls are so strong, our defense is so strong, our provisions so secure, we can see the future for 10 years. He had no need to, as it were, be rationed, no need to be cautious. He could be utterly secure. He personifies in so many ways, this king, the example that Christ gives many years later, as Christ speaks of one whose produce was so great, whose gain was so great that he had to knock down his barns and build greater. And then, of course, that terrible address comes to him. Thou fool, this night thy soul is required of thee. Well, Belshazzar is utterly secure, utterly sure. And all he wants to do is to solve this writing that has appeared. Notice again the detail. That in order that the king may see clearly the words that are written, the writing in verse 5, it's opposite the lampstand, so that the light of the lampstand comes upon these words and he can see it clearly. He can't understand it, but he sees it. He is terrified by it, but he sees it. And of course, in response to the Queen Mother's reminder concerning Daniel, he brings Daniel in before the king. And, you know, we need at this point to remind ourselves of the contrast between Belshazzar and his grandfather. You remember how when Belshazzar, when Daniel deals with King Nebuchadnezzar. Just turn back with me, if you will, to verse 19 of Daniel chapter 4, where Daniel has been told the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has had. And in verse 19, he is astonished and troubled. His thoughts troubled him. And as we said this morning, as Christians, as believers, we never desire harm to any individual. And here, Belteshazzar, that's the name that Daniel had been given, he must answer the king. And he says, my Lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. He wants to see good for the king, and he's going to conclude the address that he makes to the king with that petition. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. And we're going to see a great contrast, because we see Nebuchadnezzar humbled under the hand of God. Nebuchadnezzar is dealt with in one way by God. He's humbled. And as I say, whether it is humbled in terms of having a sense of destiny in the hand of God, as Cyrus would a little later, as he brings the people of God back to Jerusalem, or as Churchill had in the Second War. A sense of destiny is a remarkable thing, but he may have become God-fearing, or he may have been converted. And whichever it is, we're glad that God had dealings with that man and with that man's soul. But with Belshazzar, the king, we find that Daniel is clear. He points out the failings of Belshazzar in the rejection of the light that he had. That is a very sad thing. Belshazzar knew the dealings of God with Nebuchadnezzar, and yet, instead of humbling himself, he has done exactly the opposite. Verse 23 of Daniel 5, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You see, he hadn't simply acknowledged God and, as it were, ignored him. He's rebelled against God very violently and made his rebellion very clear. And he has blasphemed God. You remember how at the very opening of the chapter, what Daniel describes now in the 23rd verse, it's a deliberate act of blasphemy. It's a deliberate turning of the back upon God. They have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. Those articles that should have been devoted to the temple service of God. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, bronze and iron, wood and stone, which do not see or hear or know. There we see the instinct of the human heart to seek after false gods that are utterly powerless, false gods that can do nothing, false gods that can do you no good. And by contrast, Daniel tells the king, and the God who holds your breath in his hand and owns all your ways, you have not glorified. What a terrible indictment of a human life. You know, one of the old catechisms, the very first question, what is the chief end of man? To glorify God and to enjoy him forever. What is the purpose of your life? What is the purpose of my life? It is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. Such an answer to a question is wonderful, but the king, you see, here, you have not glorified. Ultimately, the glory of God is a great purpose, a great matter for which everything exists. So Christ, when he is about to face his crucifixion, he speaks and says, as he prays to his Father, and he prays, glorify thy name, and the answer comes, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. And so this king is indicted. And he's indicted in a particular and remarkable way, a way that is impossible to explain. You can't explain away how the fingers of a man's hand can appear upon the wall and write upon a wall. But it happened, and it wrote an inscription that no one could read. And it tells us that this kingdom that is so secure, this kingdom which now is going to last, it has supplies for 10 years at least. And I was going to mention there was another authority that Ian Leadham coincidentally was watching or listening to, and it suggested that there was 20 years of supply in Babylon. Well, you know, it's a huge reservoir of resource. And, you know, they had no fear. They were completely secure. But nonetheless, the message comes. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. You know, as you read through the book of Daniel, one of the things you find is that all of the political kingdoms, all of the empires, they're all under the control and the knowledge of God. We find in the book of Daniel, we find Alexander the Great, we find the Greeks, we find the Romans, we find every one of the kingdoms of that era, and we see the way in which God has ruled and been sovereign and appointed these different groups, these different kingdoms. But the kingdom that Belshazzar is second ruler in is going to be finished. And you know, just as we have far more detail concerning, say, the life of Nebuchadnezzar than we do of the life of Belshazzar, we can almost liken it, for those that are interested in such things, that with Belshazzar we have almost a snapshot. We could say financially it's a balance sheet on the one day. And we read, whereas with Nebuchadnezzar we read several different incidents. It's more like the profit and loss account, covering a period of time. Well, what do we find for this balance sheet of this man, this king, this ruler? Well, the balance sheet says your liabilities outweigh your assets. That's never a good thing. Sometimes you find creative accountants, we can revalue the buildings. We can add a value because of that. We can enhance the assets. Or we'll take these liabilities off, we'll be creative, we'll use a leasing mechanism and we'll take the liabilities off the balance sheet. But you see in verse 27, Tikal, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. He cannot meet the liabilities he's responsible for. The balance sheet doesn't balance. And then your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And even at this stage, Belshazzar doesn't believe what he's being told. He makes Daniel the third ruler in the kingdom, which is what he'd promised. He's anticipating that he has security for 10 years into the future, 20 years into the future. And so what? God has said these things. As far as he is concerned, so what? It's water off a duck's back to this king. He doesn't bow to any higher authority. They make a proclamation concerning Daniel that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then we find a very short description. Verse 30. That very night. Just like the man in the story that Jesus told who built his barns, this night your soul is required of thee. That very night Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. What it appears happened was this. The city was stocked with provisions for years. They had a water supply with a river running into the city that was secure. But those besieging the city, they dammed the river. And the riverbed became dry very quickly. And they were able to march as an army into the city along the riverbed, effectively beneath the wall of the city. And suddenly you have your army. There are no defences around the river. And suddenly you have your army threatening you inside the city that is so secure. And this man, who probably wasn't even born when Daniel went into captivity, and suddenly the kingdom belongs to him. And Darius, you remember I pointed out that Daniel has effectively been sidelined by Belshazzar. His prejudice against the God of Daniel meant that he wasn't going to have Daniel in anything like his cabinet, in anything like his bureaucracy, his civil service. He might have been the most able man, the most trustworthy man, but he wasn't going to be anywhere near Belshazzar in his rule, in his government. Not until the events of this night anyway. But one of the first things that Darius does in chapter 6 verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom. You see, we have an insight here into the way in which a kingdom is ruled. It's fascinating to look at the way in which, for example, the empire that was the British Empire, the way in which people were trained to administer that empire and to rule and to govern. And there are countries which have been far more in difficulty since the loss of the empire than they were than they were under the time of empire, far more feuding and conflict and so on. But here, what we find is that over those 120 satraps were 3 governors that the satraps would give account to. And Darius immediately, from this description, gives Daniel his place and prominence back in the kingdom. And he does that because he knows that Daniel can be trusted. Why does he do that? So that the king would suffer no loss. And we find in Daniel 6, and we won't go obviously into the whole chapter, but we find in Daniel 6 that the king is giving thought to setting him over the whole realm, because he is recognized, as Nebuchadnezzar did, the faithfulness of Daniel, the giftedness of that man. We don't deny the giftedness. He had a marvelous intellect, a marvelous faithfulness, a marvelous ability. You know, there are people, whether it's in Christian circles or whether it's in other circles, who are incredibly gifted individuals, and Daniel was one of those. And the king is intending to set him over the whole realm. And we mustn't jump ahead too far. But we find, just as we find a statue raised and a furnace heated 7 times, just as we find a dream that cannot be interpreted, just as we find the fingers of a hand, we find that again, Daniel faces a great persecution and great hardship because of his faithfulness to his God. And he faces the immediate loss of his life. But he bears these things with great courage and great dependence upon his God. Well, we'll leave that till 2 or 3 weeks' time. Ian Leedham, I think, will be preaching the next 2 Sunday evenings. We're going to sing 719.